I want to tell you today one of the greatest spiritual truths you will ever hear. And to get into it, here's a quick story from church history. One of the greatest theologians and philosophers who has ever lived is St. Thomas Aquinas, who died in 1274. Now, after St. Augustine, he's probably the most influential Christian thinker in history. And Thomas wrote so much material, an extraordinary body of work that was culminating in later life with a huge systematic work called Summa Theologiae. Well, on the feast of St. Nicholas in December 1273, Thomas was celebrating the Mass at a local church, and during the service, he received an incredible revelation from Jesus. Now, he never told anyone exactly what he saw, but it was a revelation that utterly overwhelmed him. And after the service, his secretary, called Reginald, asked him if he was going back to his writing now. And here's what Aquinas said: "I can write no more. I have seen things that make my writing seem like straw." Here was a man who dedicated a lifetime to Christian theology and philosophy, who'd written more than almost anyone in history. But that one experience of Jesus on the feast of St. Nicholas outweighed every ounce of learning he had ever received. And he wrote no more, and his great work, the Summa Theologiae, remained unfinished. Here's a very simple spiritual truth. It doesn't matter how long you've been coming to church. It doesn't matter how much religious knowledge you might have. At the end of the day, none of that counts for anything. What really matters is not our knowledge so much as our experience of God. And here's the good news for many of us. You don't need to have been coming to church very long to have a deep experience of God. Your experience of God is all that matters. It's all that counts in the kingdom of God. And no one knew that better than the Apostle Paul. He was a man of deep religious knowledge, a learned Pharisee of many years standing, and he had enjoyed the popularity and the power it brought. And we hear that from his letter to the Galatians, chapter 1. In verse 14, he says, "I advanced in Judaism beyond many." And then he says, "I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors." Paul knew his faith traditions. People were no doubt in awe at his learning and years of experience as a faith leader. In verse 13, he says that I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. He had lived a life based on power and learning and a desire to be popular with his followers. But all that changed when he came into a relationship with Jesus. In Galatians 1 verse 10, he says, "Am I now seeking human approval? If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ." It all changed when he met Jesus, when he experienced the love of Jesus for himself. When Paul was converted on the road to Damascus, he realized the emptiness of how he'd been living, and he committed himself to change. So rather than head straight back to Jerusalem to align himself with Jesus' disciples, he decided to head off on his own, first to Arabia, then to Damascus for a period of 3 years. And only after 3 years on his own did he go to Jerusalem to spend a fortnight with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Now, this was a really wise decision, because Paul was able to say to the Galatians that he was not part of any political party in the church. He wasn't aligned to Peter's teaching or John's teaching or Thomas's teaching. He hadn't wormed his way into the power group or sought to influence the disciples and the believers in any way whatsoever. Paul was absolutely independent of mind because his claim to authority was based on his experience of God, not any head knowledge he had or any play for power he'd engaged in. In Galatians 1, verses 11 to 12, he says this, "For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin, for I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." Despite all of his learning, his years as a Pharisee, his zealous and fervent religious spirit, Paul didn't claim any of that as the basis for his ministry. The only basis for his ministry was the revelation of Jesus Christ that he'd received, his direct and personal experience of God. Paul knew that no one can be educated into the kingdom of God. No one gains salvation by developing head knowledge. The only way to enjoy fullness of life with God is through personal experience. And so it is for us too. It's not what we know of God in our head that counts. It's what we experience of God in our lives that really matters. What we experience of God's love and guidance and peace and forgiveness. These are the important things. Now, that's not to say that knowledge isn't important. Of course it is, not just for the sake of it, but because as we grow in knowledge of God, we're better prepared to be taken into the deep things of God. So we must devote ourselves to Bible study and prayer and learning about the faith. But ultimately, God's grace cuts through all that, and it's what we experience of him that really counts and transforms our lives. And I think there's a responsibility on each one of us to share our experience of God with one another. As Christians, we each have had and continue to have deep experiences of God in our lives. And it's a real form of encouragement for us to share those experiences with one another. Each one of us grows with God the more that we hear about what God is doing in each other's lives. And Paul knew that. And twice he hints at it in Galatians chapter 1. In verse 11, he says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters. And in verse 24, he says, they glorify God because of me. So I'd urge you not to be shy in speaking about what God is doing in your life. In 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, God says this to Samuel, the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. It's our heart that matters to God, not the amount of knowledge we have or how important our position may seem in the church. If you are strong in knowledge, this passage in Galatians calls you to reassess yourself in deep humility to make sure that you're relying on your experience of God, not your intelligence. And if you're weak in knowledge, this passage from Galatians 1 gives you real comfort and confidence in yourself that God measures your heart, not your head, and that you are acceptable and pleasing to God just as you are. The Apostle Paul was one of the greatest thinkers in the early church, but he knew that his knowledge was far less important than his experience of Jesus Christ. Thomas Aquinas was one of the most influential thinkers in the history of the church, but he knew that his knowledge was nothing compared to his experience of Jesus Christ. Of course, we must seek knowledge. We must study the scriptures. We must learn from church history. We must read and absorb knowledge from Christians far wiser than us. But more than that, we must pursue Jesus and experience his love for us. Ultimately, it is only that experience of Jesus that counts for anything in life. Have you experienced Jesus for yourself?